We've talked about the biodiversity crisis and our interview with Nina Marie Lister. We really focused on the barriers that people face when they attempt to plant native pollinator gardens, particularly in their front lawns. I mean, she was like practically taken to court. We want to tell our listeners who we've been speaking with today because I really feel like this conversation helped me understand the connections between native plants and the food system, as well as some of the very doable steps we can make a difference.
So today we're chatting with Doug Tallamy, the TA, Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. Doug is the author of over 112 publications, including books like Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, Nature's Best Hope, and his latest, The Nature of Oaks.
112 publications. That's wild. Doug is also the founder of Homegrown National Park, which is a really great organization whose mission is to convert 20 million acres of privately owned land, basically from lawns, to native gardens that support plant and animal life.
I found this conversation so fascinating, and I learned about some really cool concepts I'd never really heard of, like Keystone species, which we'll get into, but mainly I was struck by how accessible the solutions really are.
Doug was really, has a great way of breaking down the issues into very understandable concepts and giving people common sense, very doable action steps that don't feel daunting or overwhelming.
I completely agree with that. So let's get to our conversation with Doug Tallamy.
Doug, so good to meet you in person. We're thrilled to have you on Biophilic Solutions Day. Thank you for spending this hour with us.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity.
I'm so excited for this conversation, Doug. We've been talking so much about you and your work, so we're very appreciative for you to take the time to discuss your work with us and your background. So thanks for being here.
We'd love to sort of jump right in. I think a lot of people know and follow insects around their lives, but they may not know what entomology is or why one would be interested in it and the importance of it. So I'd love to we always like to kick off with, what sort of your background and what led you into the research and studies that you do.
So nobody had to convince me that natural things were interesting. But, growing up, I didn't know anything about insects. I liked turtles and snakes. And in college, I was a biology major, and I had an entomology course taught by Dr. Bugbee, no less. And in my junior year, it was really interesting. So I ended up going into entomology in graduate school. Entomology is the study of insects. I really focused on ecological interactions, behavioral interactions. I would call myself a behavioral ecologist that focuses on insects. They're very convenient research organisms because they have such fast generation times. And I didn't get into the conservation aspects until about 20 years later, when my wife and I moved onto our property in southeast Pennsylvania. It was thoroughly overrun with non-native plants. It was there that I realized, well, our insects really are not eating these, and we started to look into it. Got some funding for some research and found out it is a major problem. It is a major cause of insect declines, and it's not on anybody's radar. So that really was what stimulated me to change the direction of my research and try to take this very simple message. As E.O. Wilson told us, life as we know it depends on insects. So losing them is not an option, and we are losing them. But there's many things we can do to turn that around.
I'm glad you said that, Doug, because I feel like in your work and what you've done, and E.O. Wilson has really taught us, I believe, is the fact that the smallest creatures on the planet are often the most important. And we always think that we are so important. We are the ones in charge. We are the ones in control. Yet these tiny, tiny little creatures hold the value and really like this tethering to all that we do and all that we are. I mean, that must have been a really interesting discovery for you too, as well, I would assume.
Yeah, in 1987, that's when Wilson wrote his paper, The Little Things That Run the World. I remember sitting in my office. I was an entomologist. I knew about insects, but I never really thought about their important roles. So it was interesting reading back then. But in 1987, nobody was worried about losing insects, and we didn't know anything about invasive plants. And the connection with plants is the critical one. Plants are capturing energy from the sun. They're turning it into food. And if you don't pass that food on to other animals, you don't have animals, you don't have functional ecosystems. Well, it turns out that first of all, insects are pollinating those plants. So you won't have them if you don't have the insects. And then they're the major creatures transferring energy from plants to vertebrates. So if we lose our insects, we lose our mammals, our reptiles, our amphibians, and our birds. And that includes us. That makes insects pretty important.
Well, and when you say that they're transferring the energy, what you're saying is that they're being eaten, right?
Through photosynthesis, plants are capturing the energy from the sun, and they turn it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. But most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat insects that ate those plants. And in North America, at least, those insects, most of the ones are caterpillars. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. And the birds represent that really well. 96% of our terrestrial birds in North America rear their young on insects. Most of those insects are caterpillars, and you're talking about thousands of caterpillars to get one clutch of birds to the point where they leave the nest. So if you don't have the plants that are making the caterpillars, you essentially have a failed food web. And if you have failed food webs, you eventually have failed ecosystems. That's where the native plant connection comes in, because native plants support insects, particularly those caterpillars, far better than the non-natives.
We've talked a lot about, Jen and I, about soil health, and then the plants. What's in the soil is super important to the plants, but this is a whole nother level we haven't really dug into in a while. So talk about that food system and what you're seeing, changes that are happening, and maybe even just what you did on your own property.
It's another level you haven't talked about. You're exactly right. It's another trophic level. So plants are the first trophic level. The things that eat plants are the second trophic level, the herbivores. And then the things that eat those herbivores are the third trophic level. People talk about a food chain. It's really a food web. A single plant will have lots of things eating it and lots of things eating them, and it looks like a spider web. It does all start with plants. If you take those plants away, it all crashes. And when we moved into our property, it had been a farm for 300 years. And the last thing they did was mow it for hay. So there were really very few plants there, very few woody plants. And our job was to put it back together. We wanted to recreate the eastern deciduous forest that used to be there. Because those caterpillars are so important, if you know the number of species of caterpillars, particularly moths, in your local food web, you have a very good index of how well that food web's doing. 6 years ago, I started counting all the species of moths that make a living at our house. And I do that by taking their picture. So I have this giant PowerPoint of all the species. But I'm up to 1,259 species of moths that are making a living at our house now because we put the plants back. World Wildlife Fund talks about Earth losing 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. You hear that all the time, and it's a terrible statistic. When I think of what's happened at our house, I am sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. We've got 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres because we put the plants back and made those caterpillars. So what impresses me is, or what would impress me is, if everybody put the plants back, we really could turn around a lot of these terrible headlines.
So what does that look like? Put the plants back.
I should say put the native plants back, because the hydrangeas and the pansies aren't going to, they're decorations. And that's great. We can have some decorations. We've got 44 million acres of lawn in this country, but it's not supporting the food web. It's not supporting the pollinators. It's not managing our watershed, and it's not sequestering carbon. So it's the worst plant that you can have. Planting an oak tree in the middle of that lawn, that's putting a plant back. If you do plant a little pollinator garden, you've created, something you're not going to mow and destroy every week. There's 1,000 ways to put the plants back.
I'm assuming there should be more activations locally or community wise, just to say why we need to bring our gardens back, our yards back, our soil back. And it's so simple. Like you just said, it doesn't take a lot. It's just knowledge, really.
That's starting to happen more than you think. I've been talking about this for 20 years, and I do see the needle moving. There are a lot of people out there talking about this. They hear the headlines. We've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years, and that upsets them. But they think there's nothing they can do about it. So my message is, no, there's plenty of things you can do about it. You can see the differences right on that little piece of the earth that you quote own. Ownership means you have the responsibility of being a good steward of that piece of the earth. We've got parks and we've got preserves, and they're doing the best they can, but we are in the sixth great extinction event, which means it's not good enough. So we have to practice conservation on properties in between those parks and preserves. That's private property. And that's where that's where this giant army of millions of people who are going to be the future of conservation, that's where they come into to play. And the big problem is they don't know that.
Well, you did do an article that was Meet the Ecologist Who Wants to Unleash the Wild in Your Backyard. I do think having a third party tell your story is super important. So what are those steps that we need to take to rewild?
Focusing on the lawn, it's the low-hanging fruit. If you reduce the area you have on, and I don't say get rid of it, it's a perfect plant to walk on. It's a cue for care. Lawn is a status symbol. So just tossing that status symbol, that really goes against the culture. But if you reduce the area of lawn, the lawn you keep should be mowed and manicured, and then people don't object. You're simply having more plants in your yard. Under those plants, around those plants, particularly if they're trees, you're going to have beds. And it's a little mini ecosystem from the canopy right down to the ground. You want to keep the leaves from your tree because they contain the nutrients that tree used that year. Those nutrients have to get back into the soil, and the soil is loaded with tiny little creatures that break down the leaves. They're detritivores. They're returning the nutrients to the soil. Then you have the mycorrhizae that are transferring the nutrients to the roots of your plants. All of that soil ecosystem requires high humidity, and that's what leaves do. It not only brings the nutrients, it's a blanket that protects the soil moisture. So designing a landscape where you can retain all the leaves that fall and you have this closed nutrient cycle, you're not putting them out to the curb as if they were garbage. It's simply realizing that important ecological things are happening on your property. It's not just there as a decoration.
Oh my gosh. Everything you just said made me so happy, Doug, because I feel like those are the things that people are talking about saying, oh, why does people have to feel like they have to put their leaves in plastic bags? And why were we taught that? But again, it's like, oh, because the lawn was a status symbol for so long. And now we're finally starting. I mean, you've been doing this for so long, but people are starting to finally listen, I believe, to why it's important to bring this ecosystem for the human health and for neighborhood health, community health, and so on. I think it's fascinating. Your work is finally being heard by more.
What other things can we do? We should reduce the lawn, remove those non-native plants, invasives. Like here, I'm in the South Kudzu, is everywhere, and is just a beast. What are some keystone species that really contribute that we can put in?
The most important scientific tidbit that we have discovered in my lab is this concept of keystone plants. It's not just native versus non-native. It's productive plant versus unproductive plant. It's the plants that are going to, I call them contributors. They're contributing the most energy to our local food webs. They're plants that don't contribute very much, and they're plants that actively remove it. And that's those invasive species that are pushing out the natives that contribute, and they're not contributing. So the keystone plant, if you think of the Roman arch, the keystone is the stone in the middle of that arch. If you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because those are the plants making most of the food. If we just use caterpillars as an index, 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillars that drive those food webs. So that 14%, we say, okay, we're going to call those keystone plants. Now it's a continuum, and the highly ranked ones are the ones you should go after. But if you don't have them, you could have a 100% native landscape that's very unproductive. It's not producing much because there are a lot. And that means 86% of our native plants aren't producing all that much. And I'll give you a good example. Oaks are by far the best keystone plant wherever they occur. So in the mid-Atlantic states where I am, they support 557 species of caterpillars, 950 species nationwide. Tulip trees, which are good native plants, they only support 21. So there's a huge difference among our native plants. And it's not that we don't want tulip trees. We just don't want only tulip trees. You want to have those powerhouses in there as well.
How do you get these messages to the younger audience? So how do we get things like you talk about your nature's best hope? We'd love to learn more about that and how that really is adapted for those that are younger to really understand what's taking place around them. Do you have it behind you? I would love to see it.
Just so happens.
That's it. There we
Ah, I
go. That's
love it.
perfect.
It's Nature's
Yes.
Telescope, Young Readers Edition. And the object was exactly that, to get this message to middle schoolers. I think it's, I look at my own grandchildren, any third grade up is fine. They could get the message. And, we essentially rewrote Nature's Best Hope without leaving out anything in the language that middle schoolers use. So it wasn't watered down at all. It simply was translated into, something that was probably a little bit more understandable. I've had adults say, "Oh, I like this version because I can understand it better."
That's great.
But people say, "Well, we have to get this message to the kids," and they are right. But with this important caveat, we cannot wait another generations. We cannot say, kids are going to do it. We don't have to do anything. So yes, we want to get it to the kids, but that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility.
In your classes, are you still out there doing any teaching? Because I feel like the current landscape designers, future landscape designers should be thinking this way, right? What are you seeing? Are you seeing landscape designers take an interest and make changes?
Yeah, I would say landscape architects have shown a bigger interest because the nature of their training is more about the hardscape of the landscape and not the specific plants. Landscape designers have their favorite plants and they don't want to give them up. We're not saying you can't sell plants anymore. You can't use plants anymore. We're just saying change your inventory. So now we have, in the past we asked our landscapes to be pretty. Now we're asking to be pretty and ecologically functional. And that's kind of a fun new challenge that designers and landscape architects, many of them are taking up. They are interested. And many of their clients are taking that up. There's this huge vacant niche out there in terms of landscape managers. Most people don't garden. Most people hire somebody. They hire the lawn care industry. I want to retrain the lawn care industry so that they can become the ecological landscapers. You just hire them. They'll put in the right plants. They'll native landscapes need to be managed just like non-native, maybe less management, but particularly when you're putting them in, they'll know what the plant choices are. So nobody's going to lose their job. We're not trying to kill an industry here. I'm just trying to change it so it's ecological functioning to their goals instead of just painting the landscape with pretty plants.
Especially since 2020, I feel like there's been such a lot of things happening globally to the environment. Do you think this education that you're doing and this awareness helps people understand the magnitude of why we need to care and why we really need to put a focus back on the priority of biodiversity in our lawns?
It is a very serious issue, but it's not the only serious issue. If we had no climate change at all, we would still have a biodiversity crisis. And what's interesting to me is that you can address both of these crises with plants. So, in putting the plants back on the planet is not going to solve the climate issue, but it's going to help because a third of the carbon that's up there right now has come from us cutting down the forests and putting in millions of acres of lawn where there used to be well-vegetated ecosystems. It's going to sequester a lot of carbon, not just in the plants themselves, but all of those plants. And that includes the prairie forbs and the grasses with very deep root systems. They are pumping carbon into the soil every day. An acre of prairie sequesters almost as much carbon as an acre of forest, believe it or not, because they're pumping so much carbon into the soil. And once it's in the soil, unless it's turned over again by a plow or something, that's long-term storage, stays there for thousands of years. So it's, again, it's not the only solution to climate change, but it's one that needs to be addressed a little bit more vigorously. And, we've got the Trillion Tree campaign and we've all those cities putting in millions of trees. That's great as long as they're the right species. It's a huge lost opportunity if the Trillion Trees is all eucalyptus. That and around the world, it really is. I mean, they just say, all we need is a tree. Well, gee, you need a tree that's going to support the life around you too. And then you're helping climate change and the biodiversity crisis at the same time.
So one of the questions I want to dive back into the oaks, because that was your previous book, The Nature of Oaks, the Rich Ecology of Most Native Trees. Now, Are there oaks everywhere in the world? I mean, maybe not in a complete desert system, but are oaks native to most countries?
There are what, 435 species of oaks? It's a big genus. We've got 91 species in the country. There are 200 species in Mexico. And they go all the way down into northern South America. But in the deep tropics, oaks drop out. It's more of a temperate species. Um, so yeah, we can't talk about worldwide. In the US, oaks occur, there is at least one species of oak occurring everywhere except the northern Rocky Mountain ecoregions, like Idaho has no oaks. The center of distribution is the Southeast, where we got most of our species. So it's very widely distributed, but not absolutely everywhere, right?
They're such a cool tree because they're so different. I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles and we had an oak in our front yard, but the leaves were like super tiny and prickly and they had acorns coming down from them. And then when I'd moved to Georgia, we had a post oak in our front yard, which was like a big, I guess maybe a more traditional oak tree leaf.
It's a more traditional leaf in the East, most people who live in California came from the East. So they're looking, they think all oak leaves are lobed, but they're not. There are oak leaves with no lobes at all. As you said, the ones with the little spines, they look like holly leaves. Those are adaptations for hot, dry climates. So oak leaves, there's something called the willow oak. You've got willow oaks in Georgia. And the leaf looks like a willow leaf. So there is a lot of variability in oak leaves.
We always celebrate our oaks, and I live right next to Central Park. So Central Park is full of the oaks, and everyone always talks about the gloriousness of how wonderful the oak trees are in Central Park. And it's just beautiful to see them throughout the seasons, even though it's dead of winter now, and it's just spectacular how glorious they are.
Where are you these days? Like, where do you find yourself day to day out there speaking? Where have you felt like you've had the most impact?
So where have I had the biggest effect? I don't know, but whenever I tell people there's something you can do to turn around these terrible headlines, they get excited.
Getting ourselves out of the silos where we usually speak is like the greatest opportunity to go and really spark excitement in people that are so used to the climate doomism, where Monica and I always talk about we are all about climate hope. And that's why we want to have these conversations with people like yourself who are really hopeful about what we can do to make a difference, not only today, but tomorrow and into the future too with the work. So,
well, this is exactly why we created the nonprofit Homegrown National Park, was to get this message to what we call the non-choir, the millions and millions of people who don't have a clue about this. And that involves social media. It involves, recording your property on the map and competition between states, trying to use every trick in the book to get message to go viral.
You're moving slowly, but it's profound, and then it's beautiful, and people are attracted to the message that the butterfly gives and the caterpillar. So I think you're doing the work of the caterpillar in a very profound way.
That's a good analogy, but there is urgency here. There is some urgency. It's only too late when the species that are going to run our ecosystems are extinct. And if you're talking about insects, they're really resilient and reproduce quickly. They can come back if you give them what they need. If you give them the plants they need, if you change your outdoor lights at night from white lights to yellow lights, because that kills insects. If you fire your mosquito fogger, which kills the monarch and kills all the pollinators we're trying to support and doesn't control mosquitoes. These are things that we can do to stop the carnage that's out there. But if we wait till these species are extinct, then it doesn't come back. Then it is too late. But they're not extinct. And that's a good message from our property with all those mouse species that have come in. When I wrote Nature's Best Hope, you are nature's best hope. We need this army of private property owners everywhere to do their little bit.
No, it's hugely important, and I love what you're doing, and I'm honored to have you on and thrilled to share your message. So, where can people find you? Is the best place to go to Homegrown National Park, or do you have your own social media? Where would you like us to support?
Yeah, it all happens through Homegrown National Park. They call it Tallamy's Hub. It's got publications there and important websites and the messages and the map and the social media. We have a great guy, Grant Jensen, who does our TikTok and other things. And it's popular. He put something up there about container gardening and it got 8 million hits. That's good. I don't, I talk to people. I don't talk to 8 million people. I'd like to, but
Social media can be super powerful.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot, so I really appreciate your time today.
So, Monica, of all the ground we covered with Doug, I'm curious to know what your biggest takeaways were.
I think I would start with this notion of keystone species. That was sort of a new term for me. And I think sometimes people hear these ideas like native plants and they don't really understand what that means. I know that planting an oak tree in my yard is a really good first step. Then it feels like I have a strong baseline for building knowledge about those keystone species.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And on that note, I would quickly point out that Homegrown National Park website and go there because there's an amazing tool where you can search for native plants based on your state and find resources for finding local plants in your area.
Yeah, that's such a cool resource. I also loved that Doug acknowledged that, yes, lawns aren't really doing much for us in terms of biodiversity, but don't feel like you need to completely overhaul your yard. Like that can feel kind of overwhelming. Start with a small, manageable area, put in a native tree, pollinator, and go from there. We promise that just that step will make a difference.
Again, it especially makes a difference if a lot of people commit to taking that small step. It's way more effective for 1 million people to convert a quarter of their yard to native plants than it is for one person to totally refit their yard. So start small and then tell your friends how easy that really was.
And so the other thing was the leaves. I mean, gosh, I loved what you said during the interview about how insane it is that we literally collect these fallen leaves and throw them away in like plastic bags when they can be so beneficial for the soil and ecosystem.
But we'll start to see, I think, less of that kind of thing if people are genuinely aware of how bad it really is. It reminds me a bit of plastic straws. They become so associated with ocean pollution that it's bad to even be seen using one.
Absolutely. We have tons of resources in our show notes. And I guess I'll talk to you later, Jen.
Bye, Monica.